The following is intended for informational purposes only. It is intended to supplement classroom training and documentation. It should not be relied on as a replacement or substitute for classroom training with a live expert instructor. So welcome to this form configuration PSRM 240 course. We're going to take our time in this lesson to give an overall introduction of what we're going to be doing in the forthcoming lessons. We'll look at right now the purpose of this course, quick recap on forms that you need to know about in order to pursue this course, a demonstration of the final example that we will be building around an individual income tax form, show you the lesson plan, the different lessons and what we're going to try to achieve in each lesson, and how to use this course. And that's what we're going to try to go through. The purpose of this course is to give you a freely accessible self-paced guide to PSRM form configuration from a hands-on perspective. So what do I mean by that? First of all, it's freely accessible. It's free completely. You don't have to own the software. You don't have to have anything configured, installed in your own environments. You can look and use YouTube to see this example that I'm going to be creating and go through these lessons with me. Self-paced, you can actually go through whenever you want, as long as you basically follow the lessons in order. You can start and stop, and whenever you are ready, continue at your own pace. We'll be concentrating here on form configuration, and we will show this from a perspective of actually using the system and not just describe it theoretically with slides which describe the process, but actually within the system how you create form types, which is the basis of using forms. So let's start with a quick review of what you should know about tax forms before pursuing this course. When we create and use a tax form, the purpose is to create assessments and create the adjustments associated for that particular tax period. There are different types of tax forms. We'll be looking at an individual income tax form, and that particular one doesn't need to have a pre-registration. So this form will be able to create a person entity, and on top of that an account, and then a tax roll, and on top of that an obligation and all the financial transactions, the assessments and the adjustments which are associated with it. So you should have an idea of these different entities that are used, the base registration entities that are used within the system. In this case, as we said, we're looking at an individual income tax form, and the important added entity which is used is the filing calendar, which is associated with the form type and the tax roll, and every single every single obligation that is going to be created as part of individual income tax form will have a specific filing period, and we'll see how the form type that we're going to choose is going to actually have associated with a specific filing period, and that's going to be directly added to the form as we create it. So, so this is the type of tax form that we're going to deal with in this course. And when we build the form type, we will see that the important parts of form types are the form sections, and lines, and form sections and line make up the user interface for the form. And when you what we call generate the form type, that's when the underlying form is actually created dynamically. You don't have to actually go to the transaction business object and create the user interface. Everything is done via the form type directly through sections and lines through when you generate. And form types can be used for both registration forms and tax forms. We're going to be looking at a tax form, which in this case, as I've just mentioned before, can actually do registration as well. It will check to see whether person, account, tax roll already exist, and if not, they will create them, as well as obligation and as well as the financial transactions. So the user interface, just to summarize, comes from the form sections and lines, and the actual functionality, what the form will do, comes from the form rules, which are also set on the form type. So instead of going to the underlying business object and adding in plugins to the different statuses, the life cycle of the form, here you do that work through form rules, adding in to the rule events on the form rule from the form type, and we'll see how that works. So as a result of the creating a form, a person is created, an account, a tax roll, and all the other types of entities. The other slide that I wanted to show you is just the overall life cycle of a form. Once we created our form type, you'll see that it will go through a life cycle. It will start in the pending state. Once we've saved the data, initially it will enter, as I said, the pending state, and then we will click on validate, and that will move the form to the validated step, which is a interim state, and there will be form rules which will check things like whether the existence of the different entities, person, account, and tax roll. And if everything works correctly and there are no errors, then the form will move to the ready for posting state. If there is an error, anything that the validation step finds, then it will generally be placed in the suspended. Sometimes could also be waiting for information, depending on how you set up the system, but it will go to a non-ready for posting state, and then the system will have to correct itself. You'll have to you have to actually edit and change the form and fix it, and what will happen is that the form will go through the validated step again, and eventually, after all the errors have been completed and fixed, then the form can go to the ready for posting step. Once the form reaches the ready for posting step, that's when the posted form rules take place. That's the creation of the different entities, the person, account, tax roll, obligation if they don't exist yet, and then all the financial transactions associated with this tax form, the assessment, the base assessment, and also other adjustments if there's been withholding. It can also add in payments. It can do many things depending again what form rules that you use. And then eventually, and that's actually the final state, resting state normally for a tax form. However, if in fact there are some problems with this form, you can still reverse it or adjust it or transfer it by basically cancelling the different entities that have been created as a result of posting. So again, at each one of these statuses that states, there will be different form rules doing each different piece of functionality needed at that particular time. So that is the general overview that I wanted to give, a little bit of the recap of tax forms that you should know about before we actually start this course. So I would like to start by showing you a summary and an example of the individual income tax form that this set of lessons will create. So I'm going to show you that by adding a new tax form that we've created using the form type, and then we will look at the form type that was needed in order to create it, and we'll just go through a simple example of that. So let's first of all add in a tax form, and I'm going to use the tax form which we are going to create as part of these lessons. And this is the final finished product, the final form type with all the functionality in. So as you see here, we have 4 different sections. The main section is found in every single form, and it's common to all. So it has a source, it has a DLN number, it has whether it is a filing type is original or duplicate or audit and so on, and receive date. Receive date is a required field. And now let's go and look at the particular fields that we added, the personal details. This is the first section that we'll look at. And here we have built this income tax form that works for joint filing for, let's say, a family, for a husband, wife, a primary and secondary taxpayer, and we will see that it will create person and account entities for these people and create the assessments. I've also added, and this is something which is done as a custom form rule, added children entities to actual real children of the person, this couple, if they want to be associated with this particular person account. Purpose being that you might want to associate them for, let's say, a child allowance or something. And this, as I just mentioned, is functionality which is not found in base form rules. Form rules, you'll see, is the basis of adding functionality to the forms. So it's something which was added, which is interesting and shows an example of adding a repeated list of children to the account. So let's just add in a very simple form. Again, forms generally will be done in batch, sent in the background, run at night time, uploaded and processed. But here we're just going through the process manually to show you the form type that we are going to be creating. So let me fill in. We have a drop down here for a title. Let's say Dr. John Smith. And we're going to use an ID type of social security number. I'm going to make something up. And we have a secondary, let's say a wife, in this case. Fiona Smith. And again, with a social security number made up of something. And here we're going to, let's say, have 2 children we're going to add in, and it's going to find existing children in the system. Part of the validate step will try to find them, and as opposed to the primary taxpayer and the secondary taxpayer, where if they exist in the system, they will be retrieved and they will then be used to add in financial information. But if they're not found, they create these entities. These children, the way I set it up was just simply they find existing children in the system. It doesn't create the child. So they have to actually already exist in the system. And then say you add in a date of birth. Simple. And the person ID will be filled in once the validation takes place and it finds that child in the system. So let's say we have 2 children, so we can have another example, and let's say like that. So that's the personal details section. As you see here, shows an example here of repeated lines, repeated form lines. Called group lines. We'll see about those. These are standard lines, and here is a example of just a label. Now let's go on to the next section, which is address information. Address information is basically pretty straightforward. Let's make up an address for the home address. Let's say okay, and then we have tax details, which is the main section. And here, as opposed to the other sections, we have different detailed fields as reported as current. As reported would be the initial, very first value that is put into the form, and if there are subsequent changes to the form, that as reported will stay there. And as current is the updated last current value of that particular field. And if you make any changes, you will need to add in a change reason. Again, we'll see all this as we go through and create our form type. We'll go through this in detail. This is just a purpose of, is just to give you a summary of what we will finally be able to create. You see these bubbles here show you the different information of how to fill in the form. For example, the taxable amount here tells you that we have to add up the salary, other income, and take away the exemptions. In this case, if we don't calculate correctly, there will be an error. So if I did, let's say, we'll actually just do that as an example. If I put in, let's say, other income, and let's say I by mistake I put in the wrong amount for the taxable amount. So this is 110, 105. But let's say I make a mistake and put 100,000 in. We'll see what happens. And here you could actually, here is your estimated tax amount. And what will happen in this example is that the system will actually calculate the tax based upon the taxable amount using a what is known as a rate schedule, and it will put the right amount into the as current and move the 5,000 to the as reported. We'll see that in a moment. Deductions is, let's say, after the calculating tax amount, if there's some sort of deduction for any particular reason, a child allowance or any other deductions. Again, this exemption here is before calculation of tax. This is after the tax is calculated. Again, all different types of deductions. Some of them might occur before, some after. But we are not going into describing the different types of taxes. We're making this pretty straightforward. Obviously, a real income tax form is much more complicated than this. This is very much a summary sheet. Let's just make some deductions. So let's say, and let's say, and based upon our calculation here, 5,000, we would expect the final tax amount to be 4,800, right? So let's say I put that in, and let's say there was a withholding that the employer paid $4,500, let's say, and the expectation therefore is the outstanding amount should be 300, and the payment therefore is going to be a payment now of 300. Now, together with this form, this couple has sent in a check for $300. That's what we're simulating here. And now we're going to save this form. And what happens is this tax form now goes into the pending state. You'll see the status is pending. And now the next step to do is to validate the form. Again, if this is done in batch, automated, all these steps of moving through a form through its life cycle will be done automatically. Here we're just simply looking at each step, each state one by one. So let's see what happens when I validate this form. And it comes up with an error, and it's an error that we expected, and the status has moved to suspended over here. We have an error. This error is going to be found, if I click on here, I should be able to go to my tax details part, and you'll see that over here, this is the problem, that it's not 100,000, and we're going to change that now to something else. So I'm going to edit that, and put in the correct amount, which is going to be 110, 105, right? So I'm going to save that. And after I save that, I have to also be aware that I need to add in a change reason each time. Let's say correction, calculation, error. So I need to add that in. After I actually save that, the error might still be shown, and this message says that it might be out of date. This message is out of date until I do the validate. So I'm going to click validate now and see what happens. And now the problem has been resolved. If I go to tax details, I will see that I have my 105,000, which is now correct, and this is actually now the calculated amount. 7,400 is how much tax I owe, and it puts in the amount, which is 7,200, which is as opposed to the 4,800 that I estimated. Here's my withholding, and here is how much I should owe. So even though I've actually added, I've paid 300, that's too little, so we would expect that I would still have a balance outstanding that I need to pay. A few other things, as you go through a form, the exceptions that the errors that happened through the life cycle are still shown. This was the error, and it's now closed because we fixed it. So it was created and then closed. You can see a history of the exceptions. Versions, we have different versions of the form. The initial version of the form is shown, and we will also see subsequent versions of at different states. And determining whether a particular version is set is something is held is related to the setup of the business object underlying the parent tax form. We'll talk about that as well. And then the logs, that's another thing which is useful to look at. Tells you basically what happens at each particular step and how things were transitioned and if objects are created. So these tabs are important as you go through and to understand the life cycle of a form. Now, if I what else do I want to see? Is there anything else of interest? Yes, there is an interesting thing here. One thing we do see is that we found Adina Smith, which is one of the children. This one was unable to find it, and I'm not sure why. Let me re-edit this and see why I can't. Let's see if we can pick up the other child. In the, I think I put in the tax number incorrectly. So if I go to if I put in the Social Security correctly, and in fact the reason is because it wasn't formatted correctly. It needs to be like that. And I didn't put any validation on that, and there's no error checking. Again, that was a custom form rule that I created myself. So if I validate now, it's moved status to re-edited. I validate again, and hopefully now I will be able to see the two children associated with this parent. So you'll see now I have David Smith and Adina Smith. Parents are John and Fiona. And now let's see what happens when I post the form. So when I post the form, I'm trying to now create the different entities, the person, the account, tax roll, obligation, and assessments. Everything should be now created and all through form rule. So let's have a look what we've created. And in the main section here, we see the different objects created. First of all, we see that a person, John Smith, has been created, and a secondary person, Fiona Smith, which makes sense. If I go in and click on John Smith, you will see that he's set up correctly. He has an address associated, and we have two children associated with him, which is good. If I go to the relationship, I can just see that there has an account. He is a main taxpayer. If I go to the account, it actually has two people associated with the account, the main taxpayer and the spouse. And the persons are actually associated over here. As we said, we have here two people, John and the spouse, Fiona. So that seems to be set up correctly. Since I put the main person as being John, therefore the account is known as John, even though Fiona is also associated with it. There is a tax roll and an obligation. And the filing period was picked up even at the validation step, and that came from the form type. And then we have the assessment, and the assessment of 7,200 is this amount here. This is a final tax amount. And you might have expected the outstanding amount to be 2,700. I've paid 300, 2,400 really should be the outstanding amount after the payment, but you actually see that the balance is 3,200, and the reason for that difference is because of penalties and interest. If I actually go to and look up John's account, we can see this clearer. I think it's this one. We have a few different John accounts. Let's have a look at this one. So if I go to the financial information here, you'll see that the balance is 3,200. The reason being is because we have interest and failure to file penalties and so on, because the amount 4,500 was added in is the withholding, and that's withholding came in on time. However, as a result of the extra 2,700 roughly, which was outstanding, different charges, different penalties were created, and then we have the $300 coming in now as an extra payment, but that doesn't offset it completely. So that's the reason why we have a balance which is higher than you might have expected. Okay, so as you see, also we see the withholding set on the actual form itself. And what else do we see on the main? We see the, as we said, the original assessment, and that's basically our tax form. Tax form now created with all the different entities which were associated, being created as a result. If I actually do one more thing before we look at the form type, I can actually, let's just reverse it, which will basically delete all the different entities that were created as a result of this tax form. We should basically set back everything for this particular person and account to 0, except for the payment which was sent in. So let's say this was an incorrect posting. Let's just see what happens. At this stage, we are going to be cancelling everything that was created as a result of of the tax form as much as we can, and you see that that's actually what's happening. We have a cancelled adjustments. We have an obligation still there, and the reason why the obligation tax roll haven't been cancelled is because there was a payment associated. But you see now the account's now up to 300 because all the penalties and interest have been removed and the assessments have been cancelled. And you can see this if I do this now, display the allocation. You just have $300 and unallocated. So that is the tax form that we will be creating as part of this lessons, just a quick look at the form type which is behind it, which is the work that we will be doing. This is the form type that we will be creating, and basically the form type is made up of the user interface part, which is the sections and the lines, and the sections of the lines are shown down here, and for each section you can see those 3 sections that we created, besides the main, which is standard for everyone. You can see the sections and the lines, and we'll be discussing all the different configuration that you need to create these different lines. You can see as labels. You can even sort of understand that we have a group line there with associated group fields. So the sections and lines is the basic make-up of the user interface of our form, and the other thing I wanted to point out is rules. Rules are basically all the different functionality which makes up the form when it moves from state to state. As it goes from the state invalidate, we're going to have to check many different things, find the children existing, find the primary and secondary taxpayer, and so on. And we'll be discussing these rules in detail and what they do, and each one what each one does, and how they are configured. Okay, so this is the this is a quick summary of the final individual income tax form that you will be creating by the end of this set of lessons. So now let's look at the lessons, the lesson plan, what we're trying to achieve each lesson. So this is the introduction lesson, lesson 1, showing you the purpose, the audience, and demonstrating the final form that we are going to be creating in these lessons, with the personal details, the address, and the tax details that you've already seen. So once we finish that, we'll go on to lesson 2. Lesson 2 is dealing with configuring a form type. There we're going to go slowly through a simple example of adding in some sections and lines. We're not going to be continuously showing actually adding sections and lines and all the configuration. Most of the time throughout these lessons we'll show you the final product at that stage and then describe how we did it. But in lesson 2 we will take you step by step and show you what you need to do to create the basic section and line. So after we've completed lesson 2, you should have a form type which has a personal details section, not yet ready to be used, but just ready to then to go on to lesson 3. In lesson 3, we will generate that form type that we created in form 2 in lesson 2, and we will show you how you then use the form and how you use and update form types continuously once you have associated forms with the form type, and how you edit and go back and make changes to the user interface. So by end of lesson 3 you'll be able to actually use a simple form. This is the beginning of this individual income form, and it will have a small personal details section that you can fill in. Functionally though, it won't do anything yet because it hasn't got any form rules. So that leads us into lesson 4, where we'll be looking at the first set of form rules based on this, the posting and the validating states, and we'll be looking at understanding and how to configure different form rules, and looking at base form rules, ones which have been provided by the product itself. At the end of that lesson 4, we would have the basics of validating the form to see whether the form has a person, account, and tax roll and obligation entity. And if it doesn't have one, then at the posting step, it will create those entities as needed. Then we'll move on to lesson 5, where we're going to actually add in some further form rule configuration, and we're going to add in a very important one called conditional line validation, and that's basically doing some basic arithmetic and form rule that can check lines based upon some simple subtraction and addition and logic to make sure that the lines add up, and they're normally used for the tax details section to make sure that our calculations are correct, and we will show you how that works. We'll also be looking at other form rules like a rate schedule, the assessing how much tax based upon a rate schedule, and also creating the actual assessment. So by the end of that lesson, you will have not only a personal details section, but also a tax details section with ability to actually create an assessment. In lesson 6, we're going to have a few topics, but the main one will be creating repeated form lines. And we'll see this as an example in the tax details section, where we want to have a deduction. And we can have multiple deductions, so multiple repeated lines of deductions, and we'll show you how that's done using a group line, a special type of line, form line. We'll also be adding in other form rules like withholding and creating payments. Lesson 7, we will be adding in to the tax details section extra fields showing you the change reason and the as reported and as current fields, and those are important, normally used when we want to track changes and we want to have the change reason always available whenever there is a change to a calculation and a number within a tax form, and we'll show you how those fields work and what each one means. In lesson 8, we were looking at exceptions, versions, and logs. We'll take an example of a form, and we will take the form that we've created so far in the individual income form that we've created in up to lesson 7, and we'll be using it, and we'll be making some mistakes and changing them, and seeing what happens in the different tabs of the exceptions, and logging the exceptions and the versions and the logs, so that we can understand the life cycle of a form. Then in lesson 9 we're going to look at other form rules which aren't related to validate and post, but are placed on the pre-processing, the ready for posting, adjust, transfer, and reverse events. And we will see by adding in these new form rules, we'll be adding in more functionality, functionality that allows you to pick up and check for the personal account even before validation. Things related to used for audit, to an audit assessment, and the different form rules that are needed to cancel entities if we're going to be doing an adjustment, if we're going to adjust or transfer or reverse a form. So we've been looking at different form rules, but not in the again on the post and validate states, but in other events. In lesson 10, we'll be looking at what it means to have a required field on the form, and the different types of required fields and sections that exist within the form configuration. There's required on the section, and there's even lines. There are different types of required. Sometimes you can actually force required field directly on the business object, or you could do so only by using a form rule. So we're looking how that works, and we'll be adding that functionality into the individual income form that we've been using along the way. In lesson 11, we'll be configuring some more functionality within existing form rules. We'll be going back to our check primary, check taxpayer and create taxpayer, and adding extra functionality related to having not only one taxpayer but even a pair of taxpayers, a primary and secondary, and also having the ability to add in an address into the form and how it creates the entities needed. So we'll be updating existing form rules. It will show you that form rules that we have in base are quite complicated and sophisticated, and you have to understand them well in order to know how to use them. Finally, we'll be looking at an ability to create your own custom form rule, and we'll be writing a small plug-in, a scripted plug-in for a form rule, and there we'll be using an example of adding some children into the form. And this will be a list of children, have multiple children that can be added, and it will have two form rules, one for checking to see whether these entity children exist in the system, and then associating with their parents. And this is an example of a custom run which I just wrote now. It's not part of base, and it's showing you how you can extend form configuration even further. So how should you use this course? First thing, work in order of lessons. Each lesson builds one on the other until the whole individual income form example is complete. So therefore, best not to skip. Each lesson is its own YouTube video. It should be easy for you to follow it in that way. If you actually have access to an environment, that would be great, because you could actually go through, look at the lesson plan for each lesson and try to configure the form as we go along, and then afterwards you can actually see the way I did it. So that could be a great benefit if you did have an access to an environment. Who is actually this course for? It can be for anyone who hasn't done form configuration before and wants to sort of get an introduction to that. But it can also be used for more advanced users to refresh their knowledge on any of the parts of form configuration. What is the expected knowledge of a person coming into this course? Don't really need to have too much technical background. Config tool scripting is useful for lesson 12, where we're actually going to be doing our own script, but the truth is you should be able to follow these courses even without having some real technical background. However, if it is important that you have some basic PSRM knowledge, you know the entities, the person, account, and so on, and how the registration works, and seen forms before, and hopefully that very small introduction I did, a summary that I did at the beginning of this introduction, should help you remember some of the main parts. But from now on, you should be able to sit back and enjoy and start the lessons, and hopefully by the end of lesson 12 you have a good understanding of form configuration.